The first point of education for the 2024-2025 NBA season is straight line pathway plays. Here, the offensive player, Bradley Beal, establishes a straight line path toward the basket, and the defensive player, Colin Gillespie, moves into Beal's path, and he makes contact that is clearly more than marginal. This contact by Gillespie moves Beal off his path, and the defensive foul was correctly called. Similar to the previous play, again we will see the offensive player establish a straight line path toward the basket, and the defensive player will make contact that moves him off that path. The offensive player, Colin Sexton, drives to the basket, and he is rerouted from his path by the defensive player, Trey Mann. The defensive foul was correctly called here by the slot official. One final example of an offensive player being taken off his path can be seen here. The offensive player, Zion Williamson, establishes a straight line path toward the basket. The defensive player, Benedict Mathurin, moves forward into Williamson, and he makes contact that is more than marginal, and this contact takes Williamson off his path. A defensive foul was needed on this play. Now, let's look at some examples where the offensive player is not taken off his path. The defensive player here, Naz Reid, maintains his defensive positioning, and he does not create any contact that would move the offensive player, Austin Reeves, off his path. We know that contact alone does not constitute a defensive foul, and while there is marginal contact on this play, there is no defensive foul, as this play was correctly ruled a no call and a play-on situation. The final play in this section is another example of a legal defensive play. The offensive player, Anthony Simons, drives to the basket, and his defender, Bryce McGowens, maintains his defensive position along Simons' path. The replay shows that McGowens does not initiate any illegal contact, nor does he reroute Simons off his straight line path to the basket. Again, this is a legal defensive play, and there was no foul needed or called here. The next point of education to review is verticality. This first play is an example of a defensive player maintaining verticality while making a legal defensive play. The defensive player, Chimezie Metu, establishes a legal guarding position prior to the offensive player, Trey Murphy III, starting his upward shooting motion. Metu maintains that legal defensive position as he jumps straight up to contest the field goal attempt. The marginal contact on this play is initiated by Murphy, and there is no foul by either player. Another example of legal verticality by a defensive player can be seen here. The secondary defender, Cason Wallace, establishes legal guarding position before the offensive player, Bones Hyland, starts his upward shooting motion. This is legal verticality by Wallace, and while a defensive foul was initially called here, it was correctly overturned via a coach's challenge to a no call. Our next example of verticality will show how the position of the defensive player can shift after contact occurs, but the defender would still be considered legal. Here, the defender, Zach Collins, establishes legal position, and he jumps straight up to contest the shot attempt by the offensive player, Rui Hachimura. But the ensuing contact that is initiated by Hachimura causes Collins' body to turn. As this turn by the defender occurred after contact and not before, this is a legal defensive play, and it was correctly ruled a no call and a play-on situation. Now, let's look at some examples where the defensive player does not maintain legal verticality. Here, the highlighted defender, Mo Bamba, jumps toward the shooter, Jaylen Brown, and in doing so, he initiates illegal contact with Brown. This A to B movement by Bamba is not legal verticality. As to be considered legal, he must jump vertically in an attempt to defend the shot. That is not the case here, and a defensive foul was correctly called. This next play is another example of a defender not maintaining legal verticality. The defender, Chet Holmgren, does not maintain a legal vertical position as his arms are tilted forward over the vertical space of the offensive player, Jaden Hardy. Holmgren then brings his arms down, and he makes illegal contact with his arms to the offensive player. To be considered legal, the defensive player must maintain his verticality as he attempts to defend the shot. That is not the case here, and this is a defensive foul on Holmgren. The next point of education to review is closeouts on jump shots. Here, we will see an example of a reckless closeout that results in a flagrant foul, penalty 1. The defensive player, Alex Lynn, was correctly assessed a flagrant foul, penalty 1, for his reckless closeout on the shot attempt by the offensive player, Andrew Wiggins. Lynn closed out from distance, and he did not provide space for Wiggins to safely return to the floor. As the closeout was reckless, and the shooter landed on the foot of the defender, there is clear potential for injury, and this was correctly ruled a flagrant foul, penalty 1. On this next play, we will again see illegal contact on a closeout, but the correct ruling here will be a defensive foul and not a flagrant foul. The defensive player, Bojan Bogdanovic, closes out to the shooter, DeMar DeRozan, but the closeout is not reckless, and the offensive shooter does not land on the foot of the defender. Please note that this is a defensive foul, as Bogdanovic did not allow DeRozan the opportunity to return to a normal playing position, but it is not a flagrant foul. Another example of a defensive foul on a closeout that would not be considered a flagrant foul can be seen here. The defensive player, Luguentz Dort, challenges the shot by the offensive player, Jalen Brunson. But we can see that Dort is not reckless in his closeout, and while Brunson does land on the foot of Dort, it is due to the natural forward drift of the shooter as opposed to a reckless closeout by the defender. Again, this is a defensive foul, but it is not a flagrant foul. Let's review one more example of a defensive foul on a closeout. We see the highlighted defensive player, James Harden, close out toward the shooter, Max Strus. But the closeout by Harden is not reckless, and the subsequent contact made by Harden is to the leg of the shooter and is not an undercut. To be clear, this is still a defensive foul for this leg-to-leg contact, but it is not a flagrant foul. Now let's look at an example of a legal closeout by a defensive player. Here, the defensive player, Trey Lyles, closes out on a three-point attempt by the shooter, Cam Thomas, but Lyles jumps to the side of Thomas, avoiding any contact and staying out of the shooter's landing space as well. This play was correctly deemed to be a no call, as the incidental contact on the play was initiated by Thomas as he extended his leg slightly to the side. The final play in this section is another example of a legal closeout by a defensive player. The defensive player, De'Aaron Fox, closes out on a three-point attempt by the shooter, Luguentz Dort, but Fox jumps to the side of the offensive player, avoiding any contact and also staying out of the shooter's landing space. This play was correctly deemed to be a no call, as this is a legal closeout by the defensive player. The final point of education to review is flopping. On this first example, the highlighted defender, Toumani Camara, is defending the dribbler, James Harden, but following minimal contact with Harden, Camara launched himself backwards while also throwing his arms up in an exaggerated and theatrical manner that was inconsistent with the nature of the contact. A flopping violation was correctly called here, and a non-unsportsmanlike technical foul was assessed. Watch the contact on this next play closely. The highlighted offensive player, Grant Williams, attempts to move toward his teammate, who is inbounding the ball, but there is then marginal contact between Williams and the defensive player, George Niang. Williams reacts to this marginal contact by falling to the floor in an exaggerated and theatrical manner that was inconsistent with the contact on the play. A flopping violation was correctly called here, and a non-unsportsmanlike technical foul was assessed. The next play in this section will show an example of a flopping violation that was assessed post-game, but one that should have been called during the game. The highlighted offensive player, R.J. Barrett, reacts to marginal contact by his opponent, Jordan Clarkson, by leaping into the air and extending his arms out in a theatrical manner. Barrett's reaction was exaggerated and was inconsistent with the contact that occurred on the play. A flopping violation should have been called on this play, and a non-unsportsmanlike technical foul needed to be assessed. We will finish the video with an example where a flopping penalty would not be assessed. Here, the highlighted offensive player, Jeremy Grant, attempts a three-point field goal, and the defensive player, Miles Bridges, challenges the shot. After the shot is released, Grant sits down in a reflexive action, but his reaction is not exaggerated, nor is it theatrical, and therefore no flopping penalty was needed nor assessed here.